You're saying the system isn't failing, it's being spoken to wrong? The chamber didn't answer him, but it didn't need to, because everything about it already felt like something holding its breath too long. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you aware of your own heartbeat whether you wanted to be or not. And Ethan Cole had been in enough failing systems to recognize that particular kind of quiet, the kind that wasn't absence of sound but the presence of something waiting to break. Or worse, waiting to be understood, the core hall of Soraya Prime stretched above him like a cathedral that had decided physics was optional, layers of luminous structures folding into one another, casting soft gradients of silver and blue that shifted just enough to feel alive. And at the center of it all stood Queen Soraya, perfectly still, perfectly composed, like the only fixed point in a universe that had started to slip out of alignment, her long, elegant ears angled slightly forward, not in curiosity, not yet, but in calculation, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear and not liking what it was saying. Around her, advisors, scientists, and system architects spoke in controlled tones that tried very hard not to sound like panic, their voices threading through the air in overlapping layers of technical language and ceremonial phrasing, each sentence carefully constructed, each command delivered with precision, and none of it working, because the massive structure above them continued its slow, almost polite collapse, lights dimming not all at once, but in measured increments, like a countdown that had decided it no longer needed numbers. Ethan stood near the outer ring, exactly where someone like him was supposed to stand, far enough to be irrelevant, close enough to be blamed if necessary, his uniform slightly worn at the cuffs, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested either confidence or a complete misunderstanding of where he was, and he kept his hands loosely behind his back as if that might convince the universe he wasn't about to get involved in something that clearly did not involve him. He had been brought in as a human linguistic consultant, which was a generous way of saying he translated things no one important had time to understand, and up until now, that had meant quiet work, background work, the kind of work that didn't end with a queen standing 10 feet away from a failing planetary system core. Reinitialize sequence, one of the senior engineers said, voice tight but controlled, and a ripple moved through the structure as the command executed, lights flaring briefly before dimming again, softer this time, like a sigh. Ethan tilted his head slightly, a small movement, almost nothing, but enough for him to notice what didn't fit, not the visuals, not the data streams flickering across the transparent panels, but the sound, the cadence, the way the commands were being spoken, because language, real language, had rhythm, and this felt like someone reading music without understanding where the notes were supposed to land. He exhaled quietly, more to himself than anyone else. That's not how that works, and immediately wished he hadn't said it out loud, because the nearest technician glanced at him with the kind of look reserved for people who had just volunteered for something irreversible. Ethan offered a small, apologetic half-smile, the universal expression for I regret existing in your general vicinity, and shifted his weight slightly, considering the very real possibility of staying exactly where he was and letting the experts continue doing whatever it was they were doing that clearly wasn't fixing anything. Above them, another section of the structure dimmed, the light fading like a star losing interest and shining, and for just a moment, the room changed, not visually, not dramatically, but in that subtle way where everyone realized, at the same time, that they were running out of time they didn't fully understand. Queen Soraya's gaze moved, not quickly, not sharply, but with deliberate precision, and for a fraction of a second, it landed on Ethan, not because he was important, not yet, but because he had spoken when no one else had anything left to say. And there was something in that, something small and inconvenient, that didn't fit the pattern of controlled failure unfolding around her. Ethan felt it, that gaze, like a variable entering an equation he had not agreed to solve, and he straightened just a fraction, enough to acknowledge it without committing to anything resembling responsibility. Continue, she said calmly, her voice carrying through the chamber with quiet authority, and the system obeyed, or tried to, commands firing again. Sequences repeating, the same words, the same structure, the same mistake, over and over. And this time Ethan didn't speak immediately. He just listened, really listened, letting the rhythm settle into place until the problem became obvious in the way simple things often were, the kind of obvious that made you question how no one else had seen it. He closed his eyes for a brief second, as if that might somehow make this less of a terrible idea, then opened them again, looking not at the engineers, not at the displays, but at the space just in front of him, where the sound seemed to gather before dispersing into failure, and under his breath, just barely louder than a thought, he said, "They're pronouncing it wrong." And this time, the room didn't react. Not yet, but something in the air shifted anyway, like the system itself had just leaned in to listen. The words should not have mattered as much as they did. But they did, and Ethan could feel it before anyone else acknowledged it. That faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, like a system reconsidering its own assumptions. And he knew that if he stayed quiet now, the moment would pass, the failure would continue, and whatever was about to collapse would do so politely and completely, which, in his experience, was always worse than loud disasters because polite ones never gave you a second chance. He rubbed the back of his neck lightly, a habit that suggested reluctance rather than confidence, and glanced toward the nearest console where lines of alien script scrolled in perfect formation, every symbol precise, every sequence technically correct, and yet fundamentally wrong in the way a sentence could be grammatically flawless and still mean absolutely nothing if the emphasis was misplaced. "You are repeating the structure," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the words to exist, and that alone was enough to draw attention, because people who stood at the edges were not supposed to contribute anything beyond silence. One of the senior engineers turned toward him, irritation carefully restrained behind professionalism. "This is a controlled sequence," he replied, as if that explained everything, which, to be fair, it usually did. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the point while disagreeing with it entirely. "Right, but you are stressing the wrong syllables," he said, and immediately regretted how that sounded, because explaining a planetary core failure like it was a pronunciation issue tended to create a very specific kind of tension. The engineer blinked once, processing, then twice, deciding not to engage, and turned back to the console, as if ignoring the problem might restore order through sheer authority. Above them, the light dimmed again, softer now, the glow thinning like it was being stretched too far, and this time a low harmonic tremor passed through the structure, not loud enough to alarm, but clear enough to notice if you were paying attention, which Ethan was, unfortunately. He exhaled slowly and shifted his weight, debating the wisdom of continuing, because there was a fine line between being helpful and being removed from the room entirely, and he had crossed it before in ways that had required paperwork he did not enjoy filling out. Queen Soraya had not moved, but her attention had, and that was worse, because stillness meant control, but attention meant change, and her gaze returned to him with a precision that felt less like curiosity and more like recalibration. "Explain," she said, and the word was not sharp, not demanding, but it carried weight in the way gravity did, unavoidable and immediate. Ethan straightened just enough to acknowledge that he had, in fact, spoken himself into a situation. "It is not the command itself," he began carefully, choosing each word like it might be evaluated later. "It is how it is being delivered. The cadence is off, the emphasis is misplaced. It is like asking a question and answering it at the same time," which, he realized as soon as he said it, sounded unhelpfully abstract. A few of the advisors exchanged brief glances, the kind that translated roughly to "this is not useful," but they did not interrupt, because the alternative was admitting that nothing else had worked. Ethan gestured lightly toward the flowing script, not touching it, just indicating its existence. "You are speaking it like it is static," he added. "But it is not, it is responsive. It expects intention." And that word lingered in the air longer than it should have, because intention was not something you could quantify or input into a system, and yet the system continued to fail as if it required exactly that. The chamber grew quieter, not completely silent, but quieter in that deliberate way where people stopped filling space with unnecessary sound, and the hum of the structure became more noticeable, uneven now, like a breath that could not decide whether to continue. One of the scientists spoke, hesitant. "The sequence has been verified for centuries," and Ethan nodded again. because that was exactly the problem. Yeah, he said softly. And I think somewhere along the way, everyone forgot what it was supposed to sound like. And there it was. The uncomfortable possibility that tradition had preserved the shape of something while losing its meaning. Entirely, Queen Soraya took a single step forward, not dramatic, not sudden, but enough to close a distance that had been intentionally maintained, and the movement shifted the entire room's attention with it, her ears angling slightly, not forward, not back, but somewhere in between, as if she were tuning herself to a frequency just beyond reach. "If you are correct," she said, her voice steady but quieter now, more focused. "Then say it properly." And for the first time since he had entered the chamber, Ethan felt the full weight of where he was and what he was about to do, because correcting a system was one thing, but speaking to it, that was something else entirely. And as the lights dimmed one more fraction and the hum deepened into something almost expectant, he realized that the system was not waiting for the engineers, or the advisors, or even the queen. It was waiting for him. For a moment, Ethan did not move, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood exactly what it would mean to say it here, in this room, in front of people who had spent entire careers believing this system was beyond interpretation, beyond correction, beyond someone like him casually adjusting its tone like he was fixing a line in a manual. And he let out a slow breath, the kind that tried to pass as calm but carried just enough weight to admit this was a very bad idea, disguised as a necessary one. The chamber seemed to notice his hesitation, the hum beneath their feet dipping lower, deeper, like a frequency trying to align itself with something it had not heard in a long time. And the lights above dimmed another fraction, not failing now, but waiting, which was somehow worse. Ethan glanced once at the scrolling script, then away, because reading it directly would only anchor him to the wrong rhythm. And this was not about reading. It was about remembering something he had never been taught, something he had pieced together from fragments, inconsistencies, the quiet assumption that language did not just carry meaning but intention, and intention had weight. "Okay," he murmured under his breath, not to the room, not to the queen, but to himself, as if that might make this feel less like stepping off something without knowing how far the fall was. When he spoke again, it was different, not louder, not dramatic, but slower, deliberate, each word placed with care, not just in sequence but in timing, in space, in the subtle rise and fall that turned structure into something alive. And the sentence itself was simple, almost disappointingly so, the kind of phrase that would not stand out on paper but did not belong on paper in the first place. The effect was immediate, not explosive, not chaotic, but absolute, the kind of shift that did not need volume to be understood, because the entire chamber reacted as if something fundamental had just been corrected, the hum beneath their feet stabilizing into a steady, even tone, the flickering lights above pausing, then holding, then brightening by a margin so small it should not have mattered and yet did. No one spoke, because speaking would have required admitting that something had just worked when it should not have. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense, deliberate. Every person in the room suddenly aware that they had just witnessed something they did not have a framework to explain. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, not out of submission, but because he had learned that looking too confident in moments like this made people uncomfortable in ways that led to questions he did not enjoy answering. And he rubbed his thumb lightly against his palm, grounding himself in a small, ordinary gesture while the extraordinary unfolded around him. "Queen." Soraya did not move immediately, which was the first sign that something had changed, because she had been the only constant in a room built on control, and now even her stillness felt different, less like command and more like recalibration. Her ears angled forward in a way that was no longer neutral, no longer controlled, but searching, as if she were listening not to the system, but to him. When she stepped closer this time, it was not to observe from a distance, but to close it entirely, the space between them shrinking until the difference in their positions felt less like hierarchy and more like focus. Her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that was not hostile, not even suspicious, but precise, like someone aligning two pieces of information that should not fit together and finding that they did. "Say it again," she said quietly, and there was no command in it, no authority, just something else, something sharper, something that carried the weight of realization beginning to form. Ethan hesitated, not because he could not repeat it, but because he understood now that the sentence was not just a correction, it was a key, and keys had a way of opening things people were not always ready to see. And as the system above them held steady, as the light returned in slow, measured increments, as the entire room remained suspended in that fragile, impossible pause, he realized that whatever he had just unlocked was not finished responding. The request should have sounded simple, but it did not feel simple anymore. Not after the way the system had responded, not after the way the room had changed from controlled urgency to something quieter and far more uncertain, and Ethan remained where he was for a fraction longer than expected, long enough for hesitation to become visible, because repeating the sentence meant confirming that what had just happened was not an accident, not a fluke, but something real, something understood, and understanding in a place like this came with consequences. He lifted his gaze slightly, not directly meeting Queen Soraya's eyes at first, but acknowledging her presence in the careful way someone did when the balance of a room had shifted and no one had formally announced it. And then he spoke again, the same sentence, the same cadence, the same deliberate placement of sound, and this time the reaction came faster, not because the system was failing, but because it recognized what it had been waiting for, the hum beneath the floor aligning into a steady resonance that felt less like machinery and more like agreement. The light stabilizing fully now, not flickering, not dimming, but holding in a way that suggested the collapse had been paused, or perhaps never meant to continue in the first place. The silence that followed was deeper than before, not shock anymore, but realization, the kind that did not arrive all at once but settled into people slowly, forcing them to reconsider assumptions they had not realized they were making. And one of the advisors shifted slightly, the smallest movement, but enough to signal discomfort with the direction reality was taking. Ethan exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be noticeable, and he allowed himself a small, almost apologetic half-smile, the kind that suggested he had not intended to disrupt an entire system hierarchy before what was probably supposed to be a routine day. That should hold, he said lightly, as if he had just adjusted something minor, instead of altering the behavior of a structure that governed an entire planetary system. And a few heads turned toward him with expressions that hovered somewhere between disbelief and the early stages of recalibration. Queen Soraya did not look at the system now, not immediately, because she did not need to. She could feel it, the way the chamber had shifted from tension to stability, the way the air no longer carried that subtle edge of imminent failure. And instead of confirming the result, she studied him, not casually, not dismissively, but with a focus that suggested he had become the more important variable. Her ears tilted forward again, more distinctly this time, no longer masking the reaction, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, not weaker, but more precise, as if she were choosing each word with the same care he had used in the sentence. "You did not translate that," she said, and it was not a question, not exactly, but it invited one. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, hands still loosely behind his back, maintaining that careful balance between confidence and nonchalance that had kept him out of trouble more often than not. "No," he admitted, because there was no practical way to explain it otherwise. "I adjusted it," which was technically accurate and deeply insufficient. A faint ripple moved through the group behind her, not loud, not disruptive, but present, the quiet beginning of a reaction that had not yet decided what form it would take. And one of the engineers glanced back at the console, as if hoping the data would contradict what they had just experienced. But the readings remained stable, consistent, undeniable. Queen Soraya took another step closer, not enough to invade space, but enough to remove any remaining sense of distance between ruler and observer. And when she looked at him now, there was something new beneath the control, something that had not been there before, not softness, not yet, but recognition of a possibility that had not existed minutes ago. "No human should be able to do that," she said quietly, and this time it was not a statement of disbelief, but a fact, one that carried implications she had not yet voiced. Ethan gave a small shrug, subtle, almost dismissive, the kind of movement that suggested he was more comfortable minimizing the moment than expanding it. "Yeah," he replied under his breath. "That is usually the problem." And for a fraction of a second, Something in her expression shifted, not fully, not openly, but enough to suggest that whatever system had just stabilized was not the only thing in the room that had begun to change. The room did not return to normal, which was the first sign that whatever had just happened was not something that could be filed away under unexpected but resolved, because normal rooms resumed noise, resumed movement, resumed the quiet background rhythm of people pretending everything made sense, and this one did not. It stayed still in a way that suggested everyone present was waiting for something else to happen, something they could not yet define but could already feel approaching. Ethan noticed it immediately, not by looking at anyone in particular, but by the absence of small things, no one adjusting their stance, no one clearing their throat, no one rushing to claim credit for the stabilization that had just occurred. And in his experience, when experts went quiet instead of explaining, it meant the situation had moved beyond their control. He shifted his hands slightly, still behind his back, grounding himself in the familiar posture of someone who preferred to be overlooked. Even now, even here, though he was aware that being overlooked was no longer an available option. It is not fixed, he said quietly, more to the space than to any individual. And that was enough to pull attention back toward him again, not sharply, not aggressively, but inevitably, because he had become the only variable that had produced a result, one of. The engineers frowned, the expression controlled but edged with the discomfort of someone whose authority had just been bypassed. The system has stabilized, he replied, careful, precise, and technically correct. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the point while disagreeing with the conclusion. For now, he added, and let the words sit there, because adding more would only make it sound like he was challenging them directly, which he was not exactly. Above them, the structure held its light, steady, and even. But if you listened closely, really listened, there was still a subtle variation in the underlying tone, not failure, not yet, but strain, the kind that suggested the system was balanced on something delicate, something that required more than a single correction to sustain. Queen Soraya's gaze did not leave him this time, and that in itself changed the room. Because attention from her was not something people ignored or redirected, it redefined priorities whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Then continue, she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a shift, not an order to the engineers, not a request for analysis, but a direction aimed at him, as if the path forward had already been decided in the space between one sentence and the next. Ethan let out a small breath through his nose, the faintest hint of dry humor touching his expression. That is not usually how this works, he murmured, almost to himself, because continuing meant stepping fully into something he had only intended to nudge, and nudging systems was one thing, but guiding them was something else entirely. He glanced once more at the flowing script, then away again, because the mistake was still there, subtle, embedded not in the symbols but in how they were being treated, and he realized, with a clarity that was both satisfying and deeply inconvenient, that the system was not failing because it was broken, it was failing because it had been misunderstood for a very long time. You are speaking to it like it is a tool, he said, a little louder now, enough for the room to hear without forcing it. But it is responding like it expects acknowledgement. And that word settled into the space between them with more weight than it should have, because acknowledgement implied awareness, and awareness implied something no one in the room was prepared to officially confirm. A quiet ripple moved through the advisors, not disagreement, not yet, but the early signs of a boundary being approached, and Ethan lifted one hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to soften the impact of what he had just said. I know how that sounds, he added, with a small, almost self-aware tilt of his head. I am just saying the pattern matches, and humor, light and dry, slipped into the edges of his tone just enough to keep the moment from tipping too far into something heavier. Queen Soraya stepped closer again, closing what little distance remained, and when she spoke this time, her voice carried something new beneath the control, something quieter, sharper, more focused than before. And you know how to respond, she said, not asking, not doubting, simply aligning the conclusion with the evidence in front of her. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know the answer, but because saying yes would change the nature of everything that followed. And he had spent a long time avoiding exactly that kind of attention. But the system above them held steady, waiting, The room held its breath, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he felt that same expectation settle on him again. Not pressure, not demand, but something closer to recognition. "Yeah," he said quietly, "finally, I think I do." And this time, the silence that followed was not confusion, not disbelief, but the unmistakable beginning of something else entirely. The admission should have shifted the room back into motion, but it did not, because now the silence had direction. It was no longer waiting for failure or correction. It was waiting for continuation, and Ethan could feel it settle around him in a way that was both subtle and unmistakable, like gravity adjusting just enough to remind him that he was no longer standing at the edge of the situation, he was inside it. He let out a quiet breath and rolled his shoulders back slightly, a small reset. The kind people used when they realized there was no graceful way to step out of what they had just stepped into. And his gaze moved again, not to the faces watching him, but to the space where the sound gathered, because the system was not asking to be read, it was asking to be addressed. "All right," he murmured. Under his breath, the faintest trace of dry humor threading through the words, "No pressure," which, in his experience, meant an unreasonable amount of it. Above them, the steady light held, but there was still that subtle strain beneath it, like a note sustained just a fraction too long, and Ethan recognized it for what it was, not instability, but incompletion. The system had accepted the first correction, but it was waiting for the rest of the conversation. He lifted his head slightly and spoke again, not rushing, not forcing, but allowing the rhythm to settle into place before the words followed. A second sentence, longer this time, more deliberate, shaped not just by structure but by intention, and as it left his voice, the chamber responded in kind, the low hum deepening, smoothing, aligning into something more coherent, less like machinery and more like agreement reached after hesitation. The effect was not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable, the faint tension in the air. Easing further, the light above stabilizing completely now, no flicker, no dimming, just a steady, consistent presence that had not been there before. Behind him, someone shifted, a quiet, involuntary movement that broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone that they were still in a room, still in a moment that had not yet decided what it meant. Ethan lowered his voice slightly as he finished the sentence, letting the final word land with the same care as the first, and then he stopped. Not because he had run out of words, but because he knew better than to overcorrect something that was already responding. The silence returned, but this time it was different again, less dense, less uncertain, and more attentive, as if the system itself had not only stabilized, but was now listening back. Queen Soraya did not speak immediately, and that hesitation, brief as it was, carried more weight than any immediate response could have, because it meant she was not reacting, she was processing, and processing at her level was not a casual act. She took one more step forward, close enough now that the distinction between observer and participant felt almost irrelevant, and her gaze did not waver, not even slightly, fixed on Ethan with a precision that suggested she was measuring something far more complex than what he had said. Her ears shifted again, subtle, controlled, but no longer neutral, angled forward in a way that signaled attention that had moved beyond curiosity and into recognition. "That was not part of the sequence," she said quietly. And this time it was not a challenge, not even a question. It was a statement that acknowledged a difference she could not ignore. Ethan gave a small, almost self-conscious shrug, one shoulder lifting just enough to soften the weight of what he had done. "No," he admitted, because there was no reason to pretend otherwise, but the sequence was incomplete, and he let the words settle without elaboration, because explaining it further would require assumptions no one in the room was ready to make out loud. A faint ripple moved through the advisors again, quieter this time, less resistant, more uncertain, as if the idea of incompleteness in something they had considered absolute was beginning to take shape whether they approved of it or not. Queen Soraya's expression did not change dramatically, but something beneath it did, something small and controlled and unmistakably real. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that shift with it, subtle but present. "You are not correcting it," she said, her gaze steady. "You are continuing it." And the words landed with a clarity that reframed everything that had happened in the last few minutes. Ethan paused, just long enough to consider that, then gave a faint nod, almost to himself. Yeah, he said quietly. I think it was waiting for someone to finish the sentence. And as the chamber held steady, as the system above them remained stable without strain, as the silence settled into something that felt less like tension and more like expectation, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer about preventing a failure. It was about understanding something that had been speaking for a very long time and had finally been answered. No one moved to interrupt him this time. And that was the second sign that something fundamental had shifted, because earlier silence had been resistance, a quiet refusal to accept what did not fit. But now it had become something else entirely, something closer to attention, the kind that did not argue because it was still catching up. Ethan noticed it in the way no one rushed to speak, no one corrected him. No one reasserted control over the situation that had clearly slipped beyond familiar boundaries, and he exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but because the weight of what he had just said had settled into place, and there was no stepping around it anymore. Above them, the system held steady, not just stable but responsive, the subtle hum beneath their feet no longer uneven, no longer strained, but layered, almost like a tone with depth instead of a single note stretched too thin. And Ethan recognized it with a quiet certainty that made his chest tighten just slightly, because that was not what a tool sounded like. That was what a conversation sounded like when it had been paused and then resumed. He shifted his stance a fraction, grounding himself again, and let his gaze drift briefly across the chamber, not to meet anyone's eyes, but to confirm what he already suspected, that every person in the room was now watching him in a way that had nothing to do with his position and everything to do with what he had just demonstrated. It is not just waiting, he said, his voice calm, measured, as if he were describing something routine instead of redefining the nature of the system they had all trusted for generations. It is responding to context. And he paused there, just long enough for the words to settle, because context was not something you programmed, it was something you understood. A faint movement came from one of the senior advisors, a slight shift of posture that suggested disagreement forming, but it did not become speech, not yet, because even skepticism required a stable ground to stand on, and that ground had just been altered. Queen Soraya remained where she was, close enough now that the distinction between their roles felt increasingly abstract, and her attention did not waver, not even as the implications of what he was saying expanded beyond the immediate moment. Her ears angled forward again, sharper this time, no longer masking the reaction. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet intensity that had not been there before. Then it understands, she said, not asking, not doubting, but testing the shape of the idea aloud. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he disagreed, but because confirming that would move them from theory into something far more difficult to contain, and he rubbed his thumb lightly against his palm again, a small, grounding motion. I do not know if I would use that word, he replied carefully, because words mattered here in ways they usually did not. But it recognizes when it is being addressed correctly, which, he knew, was not much safer. The silence that followed stretched again, but it was not empty. It was full of calculations, of people trying to reconcile what they had seen with what they believed to be true. And somewhere behind him, a console emitted a soft, steady tone, not an alert, not a warning, but something closer to confirmation. Ethan glanced toward it briefly, then back, and the faintest hint of dry humor touched his expression. That is usually a good sign, he murmured, because humor, even now, was still the easiest way to keep the moment from becoming too heavy to manage. Queen Soraya took another step, closing the final distance, and for the first time since this had begun, there was no remaining sense of hierarchy in the space between them, only focus, precise and deliberate. And when she spoke again, her voice was lower, quieter, but far more direct. You said it was incomplete, she said, her gaze steady. Then what comes next? And the question did not ripple outward to the room. It remained between them, contained, specific, as if she already understood that whatever answer followed would not belong to the system alone. Ethan felt that same awareness settle on him again. Not pressure, not demand, but expectation, the kind that did not force action, but made inaction impossible. and he looked once more toward the shifting light above, toward the structure that now held steady as if waiting, and he realized, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that the sentence he had spoken was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that had been waiting far longer than anyone in the room was prepared to admit. The question did not echo through the chamber. It settled, precise and contained, and that made it far more difficult to ignore, because it was not directed at the room, it was directed at him, and Ethan felt that distinction immediately. The way expectation narrowed from something general into something specific, something that did not allow him to remain an observer any longer. He did not answer right away. Not because he did not know, but because knowing and saying were two very different things, and he had learned, often the hard way, that once something like this was spoken, it could not be taken back, not from a system, and definitely not from a queen. He let his gaze drift upward again, toward the layered structure that now held steady, not just stable but attentive, the light no longer fluctuating, the hum no longer strained, but present in a way that suggested awareness of its own continuity, and that was the part that made him pause, because systems did not usually wait unless they had been designed to expect something more. "It is not a command," he said finally, his voice quieter now, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if the words themselves required careful handling. "It is a response," and he could feel the shift that followed, not outward, not dramatic, but inward, the kind of shift that changed how a room understood what it was witnessing. Behind Queen Soraya, one of the advisors inhaled slightly, a subtle reaction that did not become speech, because even objection required a framework, and that framework was no longer holding. Ethan moved his hands slightly from behind his back, not fully, just enough to break the static posture he had maintained, and he rubbed his thumb lightly against his fingers again, grounding himself in something small while the larger implications unfolded. "You do not finish it by giving it another instruction," he continued, and now his tone carried a faint thread of something else, not confidence exactly, but clarity, the kind that came from recognizing a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. "You finish it by acknowledging what it already did," and that word lingered again, acknowledgement, heavier now, because it had already reshaped the conversation once. Queen Soraya did not look away from him, and for the first time, there was a visible shift in her expression, not dramatic, not overt, but enough to register, a subtle softening at the edges, not of emotion, but of resistance, as if a conclusion she had not expected was aligning itself with something she could no longer dismiss. Her ears angled forward fully now, no longer moderated, and when she spoke, her voice was lower, quieter, but far more focused than before. "Then say it," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any elaborate command could have. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that acknowledged there was no longer a reason to hesitate, and he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, not to her, but to himself, as if confirming a decision that had already been made. When he spoke again, the words were softer than before, not because they lacked strength, but because they did not need it, each syllable placed with care, with intention, not as a directive, not as a correction, but as recognition, and as the sentence left his voice, the chamber responded in a way that was impossible to ignore, not with movement, not with light, but with stillness so complete it felt like the space itself had paused to receive it. The hum beneath their feet did not just stabilize, it deepened, resonant, layered, no longer a single tone, but something richer, something that felt less like output and more like reply. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would not diminish what had just occurred, and even the systems around them seemed to quiet, as if unnecessary processes had stepped back to allow something more important to take precedence. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly as the final words settled, not out of uncertainty, but because he understood now that whatever he had just completed was not a repair, it was a continuation of something that had been waiting far longer than any of them had realized. Queen Soraya stepped forward again, close enough now that there was no distance left to measure, and when she looked at him, truly looked, there was no trace of dismissal, no hint of doubt, only a sharp, unmistakable recognition that had not been there before, and when she spoke, her voice carried that shift with it, quiet but absolute. "That was not just language," she said, and this time, It was not a question. It was a realization taking form. Ethan gave a faint, almost self-aware exhale, the edges of a dry smile appearing and fading just as quickly. No, he said softly, because there was no point in pretending otherwise anymore. It was never just language, and as the chamber remained still, as the system held not just stable but complete, as the silence settled into something that felt less like an absence and more like a presence, it became clear that whatever had just been answered had not been waiting for instructions. It had been waiting to be understood. For a long moment, no one in the chamber seemed willing to be the first to break what had settled there, because it was no longer silence in the usual sense. It was something denser, something that carried weight, like the air itself had acknowledged a shift that none of them had language for yet, and Ethan stood in the middle of it, aware in a distant, almost detached way that the easiest part of this had already happened. The speaking, the correction, the completion, and what came next would not be solved with another sentence. The system above them remained steady, not just functioning, but present, the light holding with quiet confidence, the hum layered and stable, no longer asking for anything, and that absence of demand was, in its own way, the clearest confirmation that whatever had been missing was no longer missing. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension he had been holding finally easing by degrees, and he shifted his weight just slightly, enough to remind himself that he was still a person standing in a room, not a variable in a system that had just rewritten its own behavior. So, he said under his breath, not loudly enough to claim the moment, just enough to exist in it. That worked, and the faint trace of dry humor in his voice landed softly, not as a joke, but as a release valve for something that had been building for far too long. Behind Queen Soraya, one of the advisors finally moved, a small, cautious step as if testing whether the world would react to it. And when it did not, when nothing collapsed or shifted or corrected them, a ripple began, quiet, controlled, but undeniable. The return of motion to a room that had been suspended. Data streams resumed their steady flow across the transparent panels, not erratic, not overloaded, but clean, aligned, as if the system itself had decided it no longer needed to compensate for misunderstanding. But even as the movement returned, the attention did not leave him, and Ethan could feel that more than he could see it. The way conversations hesitated before forming, the way glances redirected and then returned, the way the center of the room had shifted from the structure above to the human standing beneath it. Queen Soraya did not move with the others, did not allow the room's slow return to activity to pull her attention away, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, measured, but carried something that had not been there before, something that did not belong to protocol or performance. "You did not repair it," she said, and the words were not a correction, not a challenge, but a recognition, carefully shaped. "You answered it." And the statement settled into place with a clarity that left very little room for interpretation. Ethan glanced at her then, really looked this time, and there was no avoiding it, no softening it with humor or deflection, because she was not looking at him the way she had at the beginning of this, not as a background presence, not as a minor variable, but as something specific, something identified. He let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, because the situation did not feel like one that would benefit from laughter. "I think it was already doing most of the work," he replied quietly, and the understatement hung there, deliberately small against something that had clearly not been. Her gaze did not shift, did not soften further, but it changed in a different way, becoming sharper, more focused, as if a new line of thought had just formed and she was following it to its conclusion. "No," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a calm certainty that cut through the remaining ambiguity. It was waiting for you, and that landed differently, not as flattery, not as exaggeration, but as a possibility stated plainly, one that carried implications neither of them addressed immediately. Ethan stilled for a fraction of a second, the dry edge of humor fading into something quieter, because there were many ways to respond to that, and none of them felt particularly safe, and he glanced briefly toward the system above, as if it might offer clarification, but it remained steady, silent in its own way. Complete. When he looked back at her, there was no easy deflection left, no casual dismissal that would fit the moment, and he found himself doing something he rarely did, choosing honesty without cushioning it. "That does not make sense," he said softly, and the words were not a denial, not exactly, but an acknowledgement of the gap between what he understood and what she had just suggested. Queen Soraya held his gaze, unflinching, and for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible shifted at the edge of her expression. Not a smile, not warmth, but something closer to quiet certainty. "No," she agreed, her voice just as soft. "But it explains everything." And the chamber, now fully alive again with controlled movement and resumed function, felt different in a way that no one could reverse, because the system had been stabilized, yes, but something else had also been established, something that would not be undone by returning to routine. And as Ethan stood there, no longer part of the background, no longer an observer, it became clear that whatever he had just begun was not finished with him yet.